let's talk about control flow or conditional statements. So we've got a couple more sections left. Hopefully we'll finish up, by 8:30, hopefully. That's kind of ambitious. So conditional logic. When you want to control how a computer goes through your program, you use control flow. So a control flow or the conditional logic evaluates to either true or false, so boolean values, and allows us to select different outcomes depending on user input or the result of a specific computation. So it's kind of like these if statements. So it's like, if I'm not home, then I'm at work. Or if I'm not hungry, then, or if I don't even know. So if I have been drinking water, then I'm thirsty. Otherwise, I'm not thirsty, or something like that. So there's 3 different types of conditional logic. There's if statements. So like if A equals B, do something. And then there's also if else statements. You're going to see these a lot. So if A equals B, else do something else. So it's a good example of a if statement, or if else statement. So if I don't go to work, so like say if I don't do my job, I get fired, else I get a paycheck, something like that. Else if statements, which means there's multiple conditions there's multiple outcomes. If say I'm 21, I can go to the bar. Else if I'm over 35, or so it's like if A equals 21, I can go to the bar. If A equals 35 or A is greater than some number, I can run for Senate or run for presidency. Else, I can't do anything, or something like that. So let's go through some control flow logic. But this time, let's write all the stuff in functions, because we're going to be using functions majority of the time. So we've got this conditional logic. So I'm going to grab these same here. I'm going to just do like a quick if statement. And function let compare equals fat arrow function for num1, num2. All right, it's going to compare 2 answers. It could say like if num1 equals num2, console log this is true. I can actually return console log this is true. So if I wanted to execute this, I can compare A. I'm going to pass in A twice, A and A. So I'm literally passing the variable A. Let's do B and C. So if B and C, and let's do compare by value, but not by type. So we're just using the double equal signs instead of this triple equals. So if I do if statement, oh no, what happened? A has already been declared. So up here, it's already been declared. Let's comment that out. Now we can go back here, execute this compare. Takes in 2 arguments, num1, num2. Goes if num1 equals num2, return this is true. Actually, I'm just going to return the string this is true. So num1 or A equals B. So if I wanted to do double equal signs, if num1 triple equal signs num2, and if I pass in B and C, it's going to come in here. It's going to say, hey, is B, does it equal C? If it does, return true, else, or otherwise it's not going to execute it, anything else. So currently it's going to come in here and it's not going to display anything because B does not equal C based off of this triple equal signs that tests the value and type. So the value is the same, but the type is different. The type is a string. So this does not evaluate to true. So we can even go into an if-else statement. We can build upon that if-else statement. I'm going to bring that down and comment this out. So if num1 and if num1 equals num2, else I can say return this is false. So this is where an if-else statement comes in. So if I run this, it says this is false because B does not equal C. So it checks this. Does this evaluate to true? If it does, come into here and execute this code. If this does not equal true, then skip over it, and come into this else statement and return this is false. So it goes if followed by open parentheses, whatever you're comparing, your comparison, and then followed by an open brackets. And then inside of here, you can type any code, and we have the closing brackets, and we have the else statement, open brackets, do something else, close out with the closing brackets, and then close the actual function. Does anybody have any questions about if statements and if-else statements? Let's do it one more time with else if statements. So we have compare num1, num2. Says else, so let's just build it from scratch. If open parentheses num1 triple equals num2, open brackets, closing brackets, return this. We can actually say number 1 equals number 2. Else, if, like another if statement, if num1 is greater than, greater than num2, say return num1 is greater than num2. Else, at the very end, if none of those two, if these two if statements are true, else at the very end, just return neither are true. Neither if statements are true. So if I run this, it says neither if statements are true, but if I decide to pass in, let's say, C, where is it? So A and B. So if I pass in A, which is 4, and B, which is 2, does 4 equal B or 2? Nope, it does not. Else, is A greater than 2? Yes, it is. So it's going to come in here and it says num1 is greater than num2.
How many else if statements can you make? Can you keep giving it variables or whatever? Not variables.
In theory, you can add an infinite amount, but it's not ideal. There's, you wouldn't have, in addition to if statements, if you have more than like 4 or 5, you can look into what is known as a switch statement, which is another way we can do kind of conditional logic, but we're not going to get into it.
Right.
It's very similar, but I've rarely ever seen like an if else or switch statement more than 6 or 7
Okay.
lines
Yeah,
long.
I was just curious if you were stuck to a set amount. Okay.
Yeah, no, there isn't really a set amount.
Yeah, infinite if you need.
All right. So do you remember how I talked about how there's multiple ways to do strings? Like there's double quotes, there's single quotes, and then there's also backticks like that. So if I do that, it still works. So backticks work for what is known as string interpolation. It allows us to write variables within a string. Because if I wanted to do like num1 plus is greater than plus num2, let's see what that looks like. So 4 is greater than 2. If I wanted the same outcome, I can use what is known as a string interpolation. So I'm going to come down here, comment that out. And I can get rid of all this stuff and do backticks. And then I can actually pass in variables by doing a % sign or a $sign, open brackets and closing brackets, and pass in variables within the string. So if I run that, 4 is greater than 2. These two are essentially the same line. And this is just looks a little nicer. You don't have to use pluses and stuff like that. Just food for thought. You don't have to use it. But yeah. All right. Lastly, let's talk about iteration. So iteration is something that you want to like do over and over again until something happens. So there's a couple of loops. There's just things called loops or for loops. There's while loops. So loops can execute a block of code a number of times in a row. So, and as long as the condition is true, the block of code will continue to execute over and over again. So when the condition becomes false, the code after the end of the loop will be executed. So for example, there's 2 types of loops. There's while loops and there's for loops. So while loops will say like, hey, I'm declaring a variable a equals 0. And I say, hey, while a is less than 100, anything within here, execute this code. And then at the end of this while loop, I say a plus equals 1. So I increment the a value by 1 every time this executes. So it's a is continuously increasing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all the way up to 100. So once a equals 100, so while a is less than 100, execute this code. Once a actually equals 100, it says, hey, does this evaluate to true or false? It evaluates to false, and then I can return that value. Let's quickly look at while loops or iteration. So I can talk about while loops. So I'm going to write a function, while loop, that takes in, I'm just going to use normal basic function right now. It takes in a value of let's say let a equals 0, pass in some number, open brackets, closing brackets, and inside this function, I'm going to have a while loop. So if I look over here, inside this while loop, I need to say while, open parentheses, closing parentheses. So while this condition evaluates the true, execute, I'm going to say console log count. So I'm using string interpolation, num. So actually, yeah. So I'm going to actually let start equal num. And I'm going to say console log start value, and then start equals the current value of start plus 1. And then I'm going to return the start value. So in here, and then I'm going to actually execute this function. So I'm going to say while loop. I'm going to pass in the variable a. See if this is going to break. Yep. Which is 4, or which is 0. I'm setting. I'm declaring another variable called start, and I'm assigning it to this argument that I'm passing in, which is a equals 0. I'm passing that into right here as a parameter or as an argument. I'm assigning that argument that I pass in to a variable called start. So I'm going to change that to start. So while start is less than 100, so while this evaluates the true, console log count the value of start right there. And then I'm reassigning the start value to the current value, which is 0 plus 1. So every time this runs, it's going to console log the start value and then increment the start value by 1. And then once it gets to 100, it's going to evaluate right here. It's going to say, hey, is start less than 100? No, it's not. So it's going to break out of this while loop. It's going to stop executing this code and come down here into the return statement and then return start, which should be 100. So if I execute that, look at count 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way up to 100 or all the way up to 99. So then once start is 100, it does not execute this code, and then it just returns the start value, which is then 100. Does anybody have any questions about the while loop?
For that function you just wrote, if you wanted, instead of to return the final value, you could just put console.log start, correct?
Where, like right here instead of return?
Yeah, because 100 right now it's not technically console log. So if you did want it to, you would just switch that out.
I could literally just do console log start like that. So functions need to return something all the time because the console.log, that's just for us as users to see. Like, I don't, like, honestly, like, it doesn't matter. Like, when you're actually writing code, you're never actually console logging anything when you're actually like submitting code to production in a code base. You're not displaying anything to the programmer because the computer doesn't care what the programmer sees. We only use console log just to like test, make sure that what we're typing is actually being executed correctly. So this essentially does the same thing. Returns 100, but we wanted to actually see console log. I just wanted to see increment it.
Quick question on this. Maybe this is a little far, but what would you use this for potentially? Because if you said you're not doing the console log, and it's not actually showing that, it just goes right to 100, what would be the purpose?
For this specific
Correct.
problem?
Yeah.
Nothing really. It's just to example what a while loop is. But a while, so for example, let's see, while loops and iterations and like function, like specifically while loop. Was your question like why use a while loop?
Yeah, basically, because I'm just picturing, we did this count, and then you say, oh, we wouldn't see it. And I originally thought when you were doing this, maybe it would be like logging certain visitors or a counter of some kind, but it does it immediately and then just returns you back to the 100.
Right. So a while loop, if you're saying like, hey, oh shoot, I'm trying to think of an actual real, you're going to encounter them all the time. I'm drawing a blank right now. Wow. For example, there's a challenge called like SpaceX Countdown. So you might have a loop that says like, hey, let me try to think off the top of my head. While, so for example, if you're singing the song 99 bottles of beer on the wall, and you wanted to execute that entire song, and you wanted to say like, write the entire song out, and then at the very end, you want to like that specific, the song is like 99 bottles of beer on the wall. Yeah, I don't even know what the song is, but like you'd want to like print out the song, and then at the very end, the ending of the song is a little bit different than what's in the while loop. Yeah, it's a really bad explanation. I'll get back to you on it.
Okay.
Yeah, you're going to see while loops all the time. Not all the time, but you'll see iteration a lot. So yeah, like, but yeah, I'll get back to you on that one, specifically for while loops. What other questions do you have? You'll see while loops in recursion a lot. And we'll get to recursion way later in the Bootcamp Prep because it's kind of an abstract thing it's kind of a weird concept to grasp the first time you're experiencing it or learning it.
Cool. Thanks.
Yep. But I will get back to you on a while loop. So there's the while loop, and then there's the for loop. The for loop is something you're going to see more often when you're writing JavaScript versus the while loop. So the for loop takes in 3 statements. So the reason why these while loops and for loops exist is because when looping through, there's a lot of actions that programmers have to do, and like through iteration. So languages have built-in iteration actions that allow us to iterate quickly through things instead of having to come up with that code from scratch. So we can look at for loops. So we can do kind of the same thing down here, but instead of for loops, so a for loop, let's see, find name. So I've got a name, and let's just say let list of names equals, Tom, Meryl, Gus, Noah, and so I've got a name that I'm passing in as a parameter, and I've got a list of names as an array right here. Before I do that, let's just kind of convert this while loop into a for loop version of itself. And then I'll get into something a little more. So for loop takes in a number, So I can say for, open parentheses, and the for loop can take in 3 statements and more often does not. It declares an initial value, an initial variable. It's usually let I, so declare variable I, which stands for index usually, equals 0. So that's the initial statement. So I'm declaring a variable called I, followed by a semicolon. It says like, while kind of like I is less than the start number. So this is the condition that we have to evaluate to true or false. And after each iteration, we're going to increment I by 1 by doing plus plus. And then we're going to space, open brackets, curly brackets. And then anytime in this code, we're going to console log. Let's console log I. And then return, start, I guess. Index. So if I execute this function, this for loop function, and pass in 10, it's going to say, hey, start at index or start at 0, and when I is less than the start value, which is 10, execute this code, which is console log index, which is this value right here. And then at the end of, once I get to the end of this part, increment it by 1, and then re-look at that value, and then keep doing it until it breaks out. So if I execute that, it says index 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then it just returns start, which is 10. So for loops takes in 3 statements: the initial variable, followed by a semicolon, followed by the actual condition we want to test. So it can be like less than, it's usually less than some value. So while it's less than this value, it's going to execute this code. And then once it executes this code once it goes through it once, it's going to increase it by 1. You can also increase it by 2, plus equals 2. And that's how you can increment it. Instead of increasing by 1, you can increase it by 2 each time. So that's for loops. And let's look at a little more in depth on find name. So I've got this find name, and I'm going to use a for loop to loop through this name array and try to find a name and see if it exists. So I can say for let I equals 0, which is going to correspond to the index of this array, because arrays start at index 0. And I can say if when I is less than, I can grab the length of this array by doing list of name. I could say list of names dot length, and then I plus plus. So I can, and let's console log I just real quick. And invoke find name and say Gus. And if I run this, see it prints the index 0, 1, 2, 3. So it goes 0, starts at 0. Is 0 less than the length of the names, list of names array? Yes, because the list of names array is 4. And then console logs it and then increments it by 1. Does anybody have any questions about kind of how this is working right now? Or what questions do you have about this specific method or function? So now I can actually print out the list of names in here by doing, list of names and grabbing the index value at that. So I can, right now it's printing 0, 1, 2, 3. Now it's going to print the value at that index. So I got Tom, Merrill, Gus, Noah. Now I can actually say, do some logic. If I want to find the name, I can say, how can I find the name? So if we look up here, we can use conditional logic. So I can say like if list of names at index of I equals name that I pass in, so equals Gus, return I found the name in our database or something like that. Else, I don't even really need an else statement because if it loops through the entire thing, it breaks out of it, and I can just return some name does not exist in our database. So when it loops through here, if it finds it, it'll return it. So notice how this function has 2 return statements. A function can only return once. So once it returns here, the function stops executing, so it never reaches here. So if I run this, it says I found the name in our database. If I pass in somebody else's names like Mike or Sarah, I'll come out here and say Sarah does not exist in our database. And this is an example of just like a fake data. So that's for loops. You'll use for loops a lot. There's one other for loop, for looping through an object. So if I have an object right here with a key of Tom, an age of 34, an employer of Code Platoon, I can loop through that object by writing a function called print object items, and then it'll take in an object. I can say for open parentheses, let the key in the object. So I'm declaring a variable key in an object, and I can console log the key value or the key. Let's see what that looks like when I print object. So if I execute it, I've got the name, age, and employer. So this let key corresponds to the keys in the object. And now I can also grab the object values in the object as well. Values, key. So it's like the key is the name, the value is Tom, and the key is age, value is 34, the key is employer, the value is Code Platoon. Does anybody have any questions about looping through that? About iteration? Nope. All right, we're almost done. So built-in methods. I know before I was talking about, array built-in methods like .length and .pop. There's a bunch of different built-in methods out there. There are common actions. So built-in methods, they're essentially common actions that we perform on specific data types. And most languages have built-in methods or functions that allow us to perform these actions. So if we're using if there's a specific set of instructions that we have to perform over and over again a lot in a programming language, there's more often than not a built-in method that executes that specific action. So for example, if I need to uppercase a string, JavaScript has a built-in method called toUppercase, which uppercases all the entire string. So for example, state of Illinois, if I declare a new string and declare it from state.toUppercase and invoke it, and I console log the new state, it is all Illinois. Likewise with arrays, if I need to push values into an array, I can do the dot push and pass in the value. So I can pass in 5 into the array. And again, if I have like a number that comes out to a very ugly number, like 3.16666 repeating, I can actually assign it or like round it to the nearest decimal point by doing, dot to fixed and passing in how many decimal points I want to assign it. There are plenty of other built-in methods. You'll be using built-in methods a lot. Here are a bunch of common built-in methods. Strings, there's character. Here are all these different built-in methods that you have access to on strings. Numbers, there's not that many number built-in methods, but it's this toFix, toLocalString, toPrecision. Arrays, there's a lot of array built-in methods. You got map, push, pop, reduce. You can definitely research what these actually do. And objects, there's some as well. There's not as many, but yeah. Does anybody have any questions up until this point before I let you go for the evening and tell you kind of what to expect next week or on Thursday? Sorry.